I expect that the king is one of the best cards for Linus range. So like I think any high card like ace, king, queen. So this leads to a full check range for Tony. And yeah, then it highly depends which kind of range Tony he has. I guess from a theoretical approach, I prefer more a small bet, like 40, 30, something like this.
What's up, everyone? This is Pete Clark, and this is the Carrot Poker Podcast, episode number 99. We have a special guest today. We have, known in the poker world as Samy, his real name Chris Dressler, is the creator of Poker Scientist, which is a browser-based GTO alternative to things like Pile Solver, etc. Welcome, Chris. How's it going?
Yeah, hey, Carrot. Thanks that you invited me. Yeah, good. Fine so far.
Yeah, it's good to have you here. I had a look at, actually stumbled across some of your videos where you used your software, Poker Scientist, which we can kind of see the poster in the background there. Good branding there, having that behind the chair. And I saw some of your videos where you sort of analyze hands by, you know, famous poker players, poker pros, and I thought that was a really unique take on how to sort of introduce the software. So what we're going to do today is actually go over 3 hands that are played with famous poker players from the Triton series, right? We're going to go over some of them, and we're going to talk a bit about how solvers are maybe interpreting the results and stuff like that. But before we get into that, give us a little bit of background on what Poker Scientist is and why you decided to develop this software.
Okay, sure. Well, Poker Scientist is GTO web-based web application. So we had the intention that we are calculating GTO solutions under perfect boundary conditions, which means we excluded any kind of abstractions which are generally used in public solvers and try to find the sizings which are necessary in a spot. Like in some spots, you highly prefer having a small size, and some others a big size. So that we developed an algorithm which finds the sizings which are important, and everything else he will exclude. So we created then these solutions, and as an add-on, we use then a simplification algorithm which eliminates every node, like check would be a node, is negligible. So what you finally has is the most efficiently, if you like to say this, GTO game plan, and around that we build an environment that you increase the efficiently of your learning sessions. Like you can play against the GTO bot, or we included some human tendencies in this bot, so you can play against a very aggressive bot or against a tight bot to just improve your game.
That's really cool. I like the fact that you're getting rid of these little annoying nodes. I think anyone that's ever worked with a solver before, and if you haven't worked with a solver, this is a good thing to know before you get started. If you have 4 bet sizes on offer, the solver will be splitting its range between them, and it might take 1 bet size at a very silly small frequency that creates a lot of like inaccuracy and just weirdness in the output. And if you end up actually going down that tree and exploring that, and you say, oh, villain bet half pot on the turn here, let me look at how I'm supposed to react to half pot, but he's also got 75, 90 and 150% pot, you might find that the half pot range is like very capped, and it's like a completely different range, right? Whereas,
Yeah, exactly.
you know, if you say that you can only bet half pot, that's actually going to be closer to what that villain is doing in game, because most humans don't have 5 sizes. They're not going, oh, this is the second most capped of my 5 sizes, so let me mix this hand in. They're not doing that, right? So I think that's a really nice touch. Yeah.
Yeah. But I have also to say then that as we included the feature that he has to search for the sizings which are important, finally our solutions would have about 7 different sizings in a spot. But then the simplification algorithm was simplifying it. So from having 7 sizings, the average is then to about 2 to 3 sizings still. So that that if you have some poker scientists, you won't have it on average one sizing. It can happen, but mostly the average is about 2 to 3 sizings.
Yeah, which just shows you that, you know, there is some EV loss there if you
Yeah.
simplify your strategy too much.
Yeah, exactly.
I suppose you have like margins for like how much EV needs to be being lost here before a simplification is actually accepted as necessary. Like, do you have a threshold there of like EV difference when the algorithm is deciding whether or not to actually reduce the number of options? I guess it has to check that first, right? Like how much EV is up for grabs.
We used an approach that in general they exist infinity Nash equilibriums in a spot. So when a solver is developed, they make a feature that if you calculate the spot again, you will lead to the same Nash equilibrium again, so that you're not getting confused. But in reality, you have infinity Nash equilibriums. So what we did then is that we searched for this Nash equilibrium, which is the most simple one. And this is then the simplification.
Wow, sounds like it was a lot of work and a lot of development. That's cool. So we'll maybe talk a bit about how Poker Scientist is recommending certain strategies in these hands that we are going to get into. But I'd like to get into some spots because a lot of people listening here are going to be like, give us some hands, give us some stuff I can work with. I don't know what Nash equilibrium is, right? So let's bring this to the masses now and show them how tools like solvers and Poker Scientist, and I actually have some PioSims prepared for these spots, are going to work. So these spots that we're going to look at today, there's 3 spots to get through. They come from the Triton Poker No Limit Hold'em cash game in Montenegro 2019, which is a lineup with some very, very tough pros in it. People like Linus Love in this game, as well as a few other notable names. What's the guy's name again?
Jungleman?
Yeah, Jungleman is in the game, and also Mika Baditsowski.
True Teller?
Yeah, True Teller. That's who that is, right? I didn't even know that's who that was. I was like, I recognize that name, but I didn't put it together. So this is a really tough lineup, and then you have Tony G, and it's like, here's this guy from like 2005, like who used to be, you know, one of the old school pros, and he's battling against all these really top professionals. So this is a really interesting dynamic. So in this first hand, there's a straddle on because, of course, in the Triton series, everybody straddles, right? It's all action, action, action. And Tony G actually goes ahead and opens in the hijack, which I guess becomes under the gun with the straddle in effect. And Linus Love decides to 3-bet. So Tony G is ace-5 of hearts and opens in this spot. And in the cutoff, Linus Love decides to 3-bet with the ace-9 of spades. It falls round to Tony G in the hijack, who makes the call, and the players go to the flop. Do you have any thoughts on what might be going on pre-flop here in this dynamic? Does this seem normal to you?
For the selected hands?
Yeah.
Yeah, totally. I think boss is pretty fine, pretty common.
Yeah.
Especially with the dynamics, but also like if you would play on a 6-max online table, I guess this hands are also totally fine to put this into these actions.
Yep.
What do you think?
Yeah, I agree. I think like the in-position player here, given it depends sort of how he's constructing his range, right? If Linus Love is building a flatting range to go with this 3-betting range, it probably opens the door for him to play some more combos. Whereas if he's just playing a 3-bet or fold strategy, he's going to have to be technically a bit tighter. But I think as well, another thing is here that Tony G, you know, lovely guy and like a good player back in the day, but he is certainly, like, relatively speaking, probably the mark at this table, right? Given like the rest of the players. So So Linus, being one of the best players in the world and boasting a skill advantage, is probably going to turn hands that are maybe mixed 3-bets, like ace-9 suited, that you could fold, you could call, you could 3-bet, right? It's probably going to turn these more into pure 3-bets to try to isolate Tony G. So when building the ranges for this, I kind of tried to give Linus a slightly wider range than normal, just based on the fact that probably he wants to get Tony to himself a bit more here, I would imagine.
Yeah, makes total sense.
So flop is 9-7-5 rainbow, so Tony G out of position with ace-5 of hearts on 9 of diamonds, 7 of clubs, 5 of spades checks, and Linus goes for a 1/3 pot c-bet here. The stacks in this situation, I think we were not quite as deep as we would normally be in a 3-bet pot, just based on the straddle being 8k and it's raised to 20k, and the stacks are about 400 and something, 460k effective, so maybe a little bit shallower than normal. What are your thoughts on the flop action here? Tony G checking, Linus betting a third with top pair, and Tony G calling with the bottom pair here.
Yeah, 5-7-9, pretty connected mid-card board, so I expect that it hits the range from Tony G pretty good. Especially that I guess he's calling wider than he should. So yeah, it fits pretty much with his range, and this leads to, I think he's checking just his whole range.
Yeah.
Ace-9 has a decent equity, but it's also a very dynamical board. So choosing here a small size by blocking some strong hands, I think is pretty fine. So yeah, I prefer just a small size related to a big size, because I think we are just losing too often equity on further streets. So and on the other hand, the hand is strong enough to invest some money. So I like a small size with semi-strong hands like 9x.
Yeah, and this is definitely one of the hands you're going to want to have the highest betting frequency with, right? Being like the best top pair, being one of the more vulnerable top pairs, and also backdoor spades. So it seems like the kind of hand that will fare very well in big pots. I think we should also note that at this stack to pot ratio, you know, players aren't very deep here. There will have to just be chips flying left, right, and center. You're going to have to invest money frequently. Some students of mine, I don't know, they maybe get a bit anxious and they sort of see it as a stack. Like, I don't want to go broke, I don't want to lose a stack. But realistically, you know, with the stack to pot ratio being small, there's not really that much that you're risking in relation to the pot, right? Because all that really matters is your stack in relation to the pot. So I think in these situations, like the small bet is fine, but I think depending on how wide Tony G's range actually is, that's going to make a lot of sense. If you give someone a tighter range, like one that a solver would produce for 500 zoom, the cutoff I actually found does quite a lot of big bet here. But when you make Tony G's range like as wide as it is, because it's Tony G and he's probably got like 6-4 suited here sometimes or something like that, then, you know, the in position range just starts to gain a very big advantage with not just the nuts but with other types of holding too, and then it begins to bet at a much higher frequency because Tony's range becomes like very air filled, I guess. So we just end up betting more often. Yeah, what did Poker Scientist sort of say about the flop here when it was doing its sorting process of trying to find the simplest strategy?
Yeah, he's having mainly just one size in this situation.
Yeah.
So you're going for 40% or doing a check back, and you have a decent check back frequency of about 50%.
Yeah.
Because just of the board dynamic and that the range EV is pretty high for the out of position player.
Yep.
Yeah.
So not betting range.
Simple.
Yep.
Yeah.
So far so good. So Linus goes ahead and makes this bet, and Tony calls, and this is where I think it's really fascinating. Like one of the things you do, Sammy, actually, because you talk about like Tony G battling somebody like a live pro, and like the way they remark on this card, it takes me back to like, you know, the high stakes poker days and poker after dark days and stuff like that, because The king of diamonds now comes down on the turn, so it's 7 of clubs, 9 of diamonds, 5 of spades, king of diamonds. And Tony checks out of position, which is very normal. He's going to be checking range, as is Poker Scientist or Pio. And then Linus bets a third pot again on the king. And we'll talk about that in just a second. Then Tony sort of does the typical, like, oh, dealer, why did you give him the king, table chat type thing, folds his hand, he's pissed off, he cares a lot about the result of this one hand. Linus, on the other hand, is very much like, oh, this is a GTO third pot with a wide frequency bet, right? And it's just cool to see the solver interpreting the old school guy. Like, I really like that mix. What do you think about the turn action here? What does Poker Scientist think of it? What are your thoughts on Linus betting small on the king turn and Tony folding ace-5?
I expect that the king is one of the best cards for Linus range. So like I think any high card like ace, king, queen. So this leads to a full check range for Tony.
Yep.
And yeah, then it highly depends which kind of range Tony has. I guess from a theoretical approach, I prefer more a small bet, like 40, 30, something like this. And then checking very often back the river. If I include the tendency that Tony has a too wide range here, maybe also overplaying a bit his strong hands. So like just some typical human tendencies. I like a bit more a bigger size. So it depends if Tony is calling here like a mid pair with a gut shot or something like this.
Yeah, and then there's some more hands that are not that far behind. The equities run a bit closer, and you're going to gain a little bit more by pushing that value sooner and denying more equity with a larger size against that sub range. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. So then I would prefer just a bigger size, like 70, 80%, and checking back very often the river. And if I'm gonna go for the 40, 30% bet on turn, I guess I would continue then on some rivers if the river is very good for us. But yeah, from a theoretical perspective, I think it's perfect having this small size here.
Yeah, I think whenever a card gives your equity a big boost, but at the same time just leaves your opponent's range extremely weak, you're going to be interested in betting a lot more of what we call the tier 3 hands, like the hands that maybe have 70-75% equity, and these hands aren't really going to want to bet with a really big sizing. So because Linus is going to be tempted to bet queens or jacks or tens again on the turn, or ace-9 as a full frequency bet, for example, on the turn, like the small bet does make some sense. The solver, my output actually doesn't mind either sizing. It's actually pure betting ace-9. It thinks this is right bang in the very comfortable value and also very vulnerable and gaining a lot from the fold equity it will achieve here. But it's mixing sizes. Let me ask you something. So after the small bet, obviously Tony did fold here, and we'll come back and talk about that in just a second. But if he was to call and the river was the deuce of hearts, Tony then checks range hypothetically here on a brick river. Linus is supposed to mix jam and check behind, basically indicating that going for value here or not going for value is just the same. It's just extremely thin, and you can do it sometimes, for balance, for range disguise or whatever, but you don't have to. Against Tony G specifically, knowing what you maybe know about Tony G, would you shove the river with ace-9 here against him?
How many big blinds are left on the river?
Not many. We're only shoving in this sim for about 2/3 of the pot we're shoving for by the river. So
yeah, okay. Yeah, then I would go for it.
Yeah. Just sort of saying you can have so many bluffs here, so much of your range is whiffed. Ace-9 is blocking, some of the hands that beat you and unblocking most of his worst hands that call. Yeah, I think it makes some sense just to say. And also, do we think that players like Tony are maybe going to raise too often earlier in the hand? Like, are they going to just be raising flopped sets at 100% frequency? Or, I mean, that was kind of the old school way, right? Like, sort of just fast play your good hands and not do much mixing.
Yeah, exactly. I would definitely expect this. And under bluffing hands like yeah, which has a decent equity but and blocker effect.
Right.
Um, so yeah, with that information in mind, I think the EV is just getting then bigger, shoving the river, then checking back.
Yep. And that's the way we should think about it, Sammy, right? We should think, here's the output from Poker Scientist or Pio at equilibrium. We're indifferent. That's the baseline, but we should never copy that, right? We should ask what happens to the EVs in reality based on those tendencies. And I like that you've integrated that, who's your opponent element into your solver. That's quite cool.
Yeah, totally.
What do we think about the turn fold by Tony? What does Poker Scientist think? What are your thoughts on it in reality? Would you do anything differently?
So he had ace 5?
Ace 5 of hearts, yep, on 9 of diamonds, 7 of clubs, 5 of spades, king of diamonds, and he faces the 1/3 pot double barrel.
I think folding is here then totally fine, because on this king he can make so much pressure. It's maybe good that he's not blocking bluff hands like a 10 jack, a queen, or a diamond. But on the other hand, he has so many strong hands, like we are talking about shoving a mid pair on the river would be fine. So yeah, having the future in mind that the river bet frequency is very high, I tend to just folding my weak showdown hands. If I would have the information that the check back frequency and the next read is very high, then I tend to call way more often my weak, decent strong hands.
Yeah, you're just realizing more equity that way. I think what's interesting here is that normally you would like the blocker. So I was kind of surprised by this output when I looked at this, because when I first saw this, I thought, Tony, you can't pure fold that hand. It's a good blocker hand. You have to bluff catch sometimes with this holding. That was my impression. But then when I ran the sim, you probably saw this as well, because the turn is so favourable for Linus's range, and because it's a 3-bet pot, and because Linus doesn't really have all that much low cards that you can bluff with here, a ton of Linus's bluffs on this turn actually are ace high. So normally the ace blocker, we see it as something that doesn't block that many bluffs on these boards, like in a single raise pot perhaps. But in this situation, I think actually having this ace is like really quite bad actually. And therefore the pure folding 100% here was actually recommended, I think, by both your software and by Pile. So well done, Tony G, for finding the pure action.
Yeah, true.
He's clearly been studying his 3-bet pots out of position in Poker Scientist.
I think so.
Hand number 2. This is a hand, I really like this hand actually. This is possibly the most interesting hand of the 3 that you sent me, Sammy. So this one is, we have Mikita Badziakowski, butcher that name a few times this pod, and this is Limitless, this guy.
I thought would be True Teller.
True Teller, yeah.
All good.
Yeah, I always confuse those two. There's too many of these like high stakes guys that lurk in the 25, 50 pools, etc. So yeah, one of the toughest players in the world, right? Like one of the strongest players in the world, if that is the case. And his opponent in this hand is Tan Juan, who I don't know much about, but is clearly one of these sort of high roller professional poker players that plays in the Triton series. So in this hand, we have an open, we have a straddle on, again, of course, the straddle. You can't play this game without the straddle, it's illegal. We have an open from Tanjuan with the Jack-8 of clubs, which is in the hijack, but effectively under the gun, because under the gun becomes like the pseudo big blind. So this is a very loose open already, and is not in a normal opening range. So right away, simming this one, I had to add that in, the Jack-8 of clubs, along with other hands too. And it's important that you don't just add the Jack-8 of clubs. It wouldn't make sense if Jack-9 was folding but Jack-8 was opening, so make sure you expand the range to include all of these speculative hands. And True Teller goes ahead and flats on the button with 6-5 suited. And again, the SBR here is roughly the same as in the last hand, I believe, like maybe a little bit shallower than 100 bigs. What are your thoughts on the pre-flop, Sammy?
That he's... I think that the sizing is fine, and he had Jack-8 in his open raising range.
Yeah.
And defending 6-5. I think that True Troll expecting that he's not the strongest player. So he just wants to play a lot of hands against him, especially in position, with the advantage of having more information.
Yep.
So I think it's pretty fine from the perspective of True Teller.
Yeah, totally. And it's one of those things where if you're playing 6-max Zoom online and your chart is telling you, oh, usually fold, but 10% of the time you can call 6-5, your solver or your preflop chart, if it's accurate, will not be telling you to call 6-5 suited 10% of the time if that's a losing call. Some people think, oh, it doesn't like doing that. It's only doing it 10% of the time. But of course, Samy, it would never do it if it didn't like it, right? If it thought it was losing, it would just pure fold. So as soon as you're a true teller and you're one of the most gifted players ever, and you've got a guy who's, I don't know, not on your level, and you have position, you suddenly go, oh, this is break even in theory, but because I'm so much better than him, not in an arrogant way, but just in an EV estimating way, I now get to pure call this hand. Presumably, the guy that opens Jack-8 of clubs under the gun, like effective under the gun, doesn't fold much to 3-bets, right? That's a fair assumption as well. So I'm thinking here that True Teller doesn't want to 3-bet bluff with 6-5, even though it can be a thing at a low frequency, because he's just always going to get called. So why would he use a hand that's a big equity dog as a 3-bet in that situation where he's going to have less fold equity than in equilibrium?
Totally agree. That should, I think, should be always in our mind, that when the calculation runs, he's expecting that everything plays perfectly rational.
Yep.
And an average hobby player has about 30 to 40 BB per 100 minus win rate. So including this behavior will change the complete range and making minus EV hands very quickly to plus EV hands. And
yeah,
you have 6-5 as a mixed strategy, like fold and call, fold and 3-bet sometimes. It, as you said, should be purely a defend, at least a call.
Yeah. And this is key, because if you fold 6-5 suited, the next time you're playing 25 in Zoom, if you're watching this pod, listening to this pod, and you get dealt a hand like that, and a table whale goes ahead and opens, small, min opens, and your hand is of this category that's indifferent in equilibrium, you're actually blundering if you fold. You're saying no thank you to money. It's a bit like just not accepting a paycheck, right? So you've got to ask yourself what changes here. So I'm sure True Teller has no doubt that he's playing this hand. He's not rolling the dice in his head, is he? He's just saying, I call.
Yeah, probably not, yeah.
So 6-5 of diamonds for True Teller on the button, calls in position against Tanjuan's Jack-8 of clubs, and the flop is Ace-Jack-5 two-tone. Now, what do you think, Samy, about these opener versus cold caller confrontations, and how do you think people maybe get this wrong if they haven't studied a lot with a solver?
Yeah. First, I would expect a high checking frequency from the out of position player.
Yeah.
And he chose the small size, so I think this is a very exploitive hand from True Teller, that he includes a lot of human tendencies in his action and would play completely different against the GTO bot.
Totally, yeah. Because Tanjuan actually goes ahead on Ace of Hearts, Jack of Hearts, 5 of clubs, and C-bets third pot with the Jack-8 here, which is already very speculative, right? Because if you're in a situation where your range is supposed to check a lot, because the condensed cold call range is just, has high EV, partly because it's in position and partly because of its condensed nature, you're not really going to be betting at high frequency. And if you're not betting at high frequency, the depolarized hands are going to be the most frequent checks, right? They're the ones that will swing slightly. The EV of them will swing a bit more towards check, right? Because they're very mediocre. So already the C-bet to me is kind of fishy. It's kind of like, this isn't something that should really happen. You don't want to be loading middling hands into your betting range in a spot where your range isn't enjoying an advantage, right? So this bet already, I don't want to call it a mistake, but it's bordering on a strategic screw up. Like, his range is not being formed here as it should be being formed. and True Teller flops bottom pair with a 6-5 of diamonds on ace of hearts, jack of hearts, 5 of clubs. And interestingly, goes for this raise. He raises from 20,000 to 65,000 with the bottom pair, no backdoor. Sammy, what are your thoughts on this play theoretically and exploitatively?
Theoretically, I expect that he should check his jack with 100% with the argumentation you used.
Yep.
And it really feels like that he had this information, True Teller, from his opponent, that he's just over having a too big frequency in his c-bet range and too many semi strong hands. So if he has this information, then you can build a wonderful counter strategy against his c-bet range, which he's just doing because he can make so much pressure on the flop and also on so many further streets. It's just insane to having this information.
And that's why Tan Juan should veer away, should avoid c-betting the middle of his range, because he's then taking hands that are geared towards small pots later and putting them 100% frequency into his betting range. Thus, when True Teller raises, he'll be overloaded with these hands that really don't want to be playing big pots. That's the human way of thinking about it, and the solver will reflect that by the fact that, as you say, this hand is basically being the middle. It's a pure check, and if you are building a betting range out of position on a board that looks more favourable for you than it is, you should actually be doing it quite polarised and quite selectively, and you should be mixing a lot of hands. So I would imagine here that Tan Chuan he's like a recreational player, I guess, or he's not on the level of these guys, is probably has the wrong thought process on the flop, right? Because I think a lot of the people I coach would have that thought process. What are some of the things people might think here when they c-bet that cause them to make this near mistake that are not right in GTO? Like, what are some examples, do you think, of thoughts people have when they make this sort of mistake?
Do you mean that when they're doing this kind of bet on these situations, what are their thoughts to do so?
Yeah, why do they make that mistake? You know, what's going on in their head, do you think?
Got it. Okay. I think they are they expect that their range is stronger and the opponent's range is just weaker, so that they expect they would have a higher range EV.
Right.
And probably that their thought is not so not including the future, like having in mind how likely it is that your equity drops on a further street is kind of complex. And on some of my coachings I listened to these thoughts that it wasn't included to find a decision in the present. This would be my 2 points.
Yeah, so it's not just about your equity right now, but it's of the kind of equity you're going to have later. So when the pot gets big, you're not going to have a hand that can never really make the nuts. You're not going to have a hand that's particularly useful in a big pot, and therefore just not entering that situation where you need to have high EV hands or bluffs with such a holding, because it's neither, right? It's not a high EV hand and it's not going to be a bluff. So the check EV is just a bit too high here, I think, for us to be wanting to start building the pot more. What we really want to happen with this hand is we want the flop to go check, check, right? We want to just have this small pot where our equity will then improve. We're actually lowering our equity greatly when we make this c-bet. But I think that's a great point as well, that people don't perhaps realize that this spot is not that great for them. They just see the ace high board and they think, oh, this is better for me. I have ace king and ace queen and ace jack more. I have jacks more. But that's a case of confusing nut advantage with range advantage, in my opinion, when people are fixated on the top of the range and they don't think about the fact that they have way more just bad hands in their opening range than the cold caller would have, and that they're out of position, which really hurts their EV later, right?
Yeah. What do you think would be his answer when you asked him, where does your EV comes from with Jack 8 from the bet?
I have no idea who he is, and so that's a very difficult question. But
Sure.
I think if he's a recreational player, and I don't want to insult him in case he's not, but if Tan Juan is a recreational player, he may say something like c-bet to keep the initiative or keep the pressure, or he may even say something like, I don't like checking and facing a big bet. It could be something like this. And if that's his rationale, then he's focusing too much on how things feel and not enough on objective EV. And he needs to let go of the desire of not being the one pulling the trigger. Some players really don't like facing bets. It triggers something primal, something animalistic in them that causes them fear or anxiety. So that could be part of it.
Yeah, makes total sense.
So then True Teller raises, and this raise is actually fine in GTO. This is the thing is with this sort of hand, 6-5 on ace jack 5, so again 6-5 of diamonds on ace of hearts, jack of hearts, 5 of clubs on the button facing a third pot c-bet, is that you don't have massively high call EV with this hand against a well-constructed c-bet range at all. So it actually drops down from being a hand that's too good to raise to being a hand that's kind of lousy to call. It's okay to call, but because it's not great to call, the raise and call EV tend to converge in the spot, right? So you can do either. You can raise or you can call this hand. Of course, as you said, Sammy, raising against someone who's got far too many middling hands in their c-bet range is good, because your showdown value actually goes down if the guy's c-betting a ton of jack 8, and your fold equity actually goes up, right? So it makes sense that calling could stretch ahead of, could fall behind here, and raising could become the best play, the leading play in EV. Do you have any other thoughts on the flop?
Oh, not at all.
So Tan Juan thinks for a minute here and then makes the call, which I think is quite a good call in practice for now, because you have a hand that, although you shouldn't have c-bet in the first place, now that you've landed on this node, you have a fairly reasonable bluff catcher with redraw. You have the jack 8 of clubs, you have a backdoor flush draw, an ace of hearts, jack of hearts, 5 of clubs. I can see this call being sensible. Probably without the backdoor flush draw here, you want to be folding in GTO. But do you think there's a dynamic going on here? Would you expect True Teller's range to be very wide here, and would you expect even weaker bluff catchers to become profitable calls for Tan Juan in this dynamic?
Yeah, I expect that he has a huge raising range here, which allows him to make this pressure on the further street. And having here the jacks, I think one of the best catchers. Like, I would expect a lot of just calls from ace X. So he's blocking some 2 pairs, which is quite nice, and having some further equity with a backdoor. So yeah, I like the call, but let's see. There's so many cards which True Teller will probably use against him that I think this is a case that he can easily decide what to do, because his range will be very quickly phased up from the out of position player. So yeah, I like the dynamics, and if he's having these informations, I think this is the way to go with 6-5, because also when you have 6-5 and you're just calling, it will be very hard to make this pressure in the future to get like a fold against the ace. I think this is one of his goals, not only getting folds from draws and jack X, also on ace X. If the round is just good for him.
Yeah, totally. Especially because Tan Juan is probably going to be making some 3-bets on the flop against this raise as well. Like, I could see again the similar read that we had on Tony G, that if the opponent's recreational, they may be bombing the flop sometimes even with hands like ace king, just because they don't want the hand to continue. They see 2 hearts and the recreational player just puts it in, right? So it could mean that the call range here is even more weighted towards bad ace x, second pair, things that we can cause an overfold. So the turn is the 2 of hearts, which completes the flush, and Tan Juan checks, of course, and True Teller here goes ahead and bets again. I think he bets about 40% pot, something like that. And yeah, this bet's like, I mean, obviously it's good for the reasons we discussed. Our hand is pure bluff, our hand has some redraw. And given the reads that we had here, would you say this goes from being an optional bluff to a mandatory bluff, perhaps?
Yeah. Totally. I expect that he's folding now hands like Jack X and some weak Ace X combos without the flush draw now.
Yeah.
So if he's calling, he has a relatively easy decision on the river. And from my experience playing against Chinese players, they're playing also pretty fast their value hands and strong draws. So if he knows that he would maybe just 3-bet ace queen, ace jack, fours or flush draws on the flop, it makes it just more easier to play them on this turn because he's so much capped.
Yeah.
So yeah, I really like the bet on the turn when the flush completes.
Yeah, and that's a big thing, you know, if you remove all of those good hands from your range too quickly, you can definitely end up just being overly capped, and then that puts you in a situation where your opponent doesn't just get to bluff you more, he gets to go thinner for value as well, right? He just gets to have a much higher betting frequency, which in turn leads to you realizing less equity. So your EV and equity realization goes down because your range becomes too capped. So it's important there with ace jack or whatever, if Tan Juan's going to bet the flop with, say, ace jack and get raised, that he doesn't just bomb ace jack, right? That he calls top two, he's unblocking bluffs, he's blocking value. But again, we have this idea of what do recreational players think when they make these errors, and they, I guess, like my answer to that would be they get too fixated on the fact that there's two hearts on the board or something and some straight draws, and they just think about, this is my hand, I have a made hand, I don't want you getting there. They focus so much on that they don't think about how to maximize EV against bluffs or how to protect their range, or you know, how to play against the polarized range. Generally against the polarized range, you don't want to be doing lots and lots of raising and re-raising, right?
Yeah. I think it's a good example of the value exploiting human leaks, if it's a leak.
Totally, and that's what solvers are for. They're not just, you know, people listening to this might be thinking, I don't care about GTO and Poker Scientist and PIO, but actually they can show you how to exploit people, right? They can be used to exploit intelligently, not just in a copycat manner.
Yeah.
So after this bet on the turn, flush comes in. My sim is saying, yeah, bet small on the flush turn, right? This is a classic example of where your opponent gets polarized by the turn. So Tan Juan's range here on ace of hearts, jack of hearts, five of clubs, deuce of hearts begins to have the nuts in it at higher frequency. The SPR is also low. So why would we want to just shove and cause this mass filtering effect that would really limit the amount of hands we could bet? So here, the right sizing for True Teller is really just like another small bet, right? Because this is such a polarizing card. And as we've said, on polarizing situations, you don't want to be making massive bets, generally, when your opponent's range is becoming more and more polarized. So small bet here, and with the Jack 8 now, it is a pure fold by this point. So Tan Juan does fold here and he makes the right laydown. But the problem isn't that he's making a mistake on this node. He's not. He's supposed to fold now. The problem is he's not playing against Poker Scientist or PIO here. He's playing against somebody who's anticipated these problems and has taken full advantage, right? And it just shows you how even if there's no EV loss in the solver, because the solver isn't saying it's a big mistake to c-bet flop with Jack 8, isn't saying it's a mistake to call the c-bet, and it's not to call the raise, sorry, and it's not saying it's a mistake to fold on the turn. But if your opponent knows that you're in that node too often with that hand, now it is a mistake because your opponent's actually applying way more pressure than the solver is, and he's bluffing you way more often. So it's just a cool exercise, this hand, I think, in the differences between GTO and the real world, where people can figure out what you're likely to do wrong.
Yeah, exactly.
What do you think is the real skill here then that True Teller's exhibiting? Is that skill sort of a predicting kind of exploit? Like he's maybe not seen this yet, but he's just is he using his knowledge of recreational players in general here more than anything else, do you think, to predict the leaks that Tan Juan might have?
Yeah, I think so. But it's maybe he's using even boss. I could expect. I know that Trutrella is playing a lot on Macau and some other environments where you're playing against Chinese guys. And I don't want to say that they play all
Right.
equally, but there is a tendency that if you are playing against a lot of Chinese guys, they have some typical play styles. And I could expect that he's using this from his experience from the past to do these kinds of exploits. Yeah.
Yeah, that's cool. And I remember, like, back in the early days of poker, playstyle was like an optional thing. And nowadays, a playstyle might actually just mean being very bad at poker, right? Like, the loose aggressive Samy Farhar playstyle from 2003 is actually just being very bad at cards, right? Now that we've got more information. So that's kind of funny, I think. How we used to be like, oh yeah, just have a style. And now we're like, no, that's just bad. You know, we're very like harsh these days. We're very black and white about things now.
Yeah, you have to roll the dice.
That's right. Last hand is also with True Taylor, this time against Paul Foy, who is an older Chinese gentleman who I believe is also... He's like your typical classic, like, older Chinese guy in the casino, right? Who's, like, dropping his chips everywhere and throwing them into the pot with, like, a little bit of attitude. And he's kind of like an old gambler. He's, like, been there. He's done it. He's seen this before. And he's wears his heart on his sleeve kind of poker player. That's what he seems like to me. What do you know about Paul Foy? Is he another sort of recreational, or do you have any reads here?
I think he's not doing it professionally, but I expect that he's a pretty smart person. So that I guess he has a couple of businesses and that he's using his smartness on a poker table, which already gives him some decent skill. So I wouldn't define him as a whale or something like this. And I have this funny hand in mind where he's playing for pots for about $2 million and went all in. I guess he had about 65 or 70% equity. And while the 1-0 is going, he's just eating his noodles and was so relaxed. Like, it was a pretty nice image. So if you like to call it talent, then I think it's fine to say this. So yeah, not a professional, but definitely have a good thought process.
Yeah, like
through a hand.
Logical and not going to be making big irrational contradictions and things like that. Yeah, okay.
I think a bit the opposite of Tony G, where he tends to be a very aggressive player and also emotional, which like the decision is correlating with his emotions.
Right.
I wouldn't expect this from Paul Pua.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Interesting. I've seen 30 seconds of Paul Foy, and he dropped the really weird big plastic plaque-like chips that they play with in this series, and he like dropped them everywhere and grabbed them and like threw them into the pot. And I kind of assumed that he was maybe one of these guys that didn't hide emotions so well, but no, that it turns out that he's actually less emotional. From your experience, that's interesting. Just shows you can't judge a book by its cover.
I think he's faking it sometimes. Like when he makes these moves, he's pretty often smiling afterwards.
Right.
Like, it was just a joke, but
Yeah. Cool. Okay, so in this hand then, what is the action here? So Paul Foy opens with pocket fives in the hijack, and True Taylor 3 bets with 9s in the small blind, and Paul Foy sits for a minute and then sort of launches his plaques into the pot, like, have these, let's go, kind of thing. And the flop comes, let me just grab my sim that I prepared for this one actually so I can remember. So flop comes Jack 8 5, Jack of clubs, 8 of hearts, 5 of hearts, Paul Foy with the black 5s, and 9 of clubs, 9 of hearts for True Taylor. Let me just mute my phone. Apologies about the lack of professionalism on the Carrot Poker podcast today. So then on Jack 8-5, this is another really interesting spot. So I gave Paul Foy a very wide range here, Sammy. When I did this sim, I actually gave him like tons of combos of like suited connectors, suited aces, stuff like that. I just figured he's likely in this TV game to be, the players are probably told, generate action, let's play some pots. There's definitely something to be said about this format. So wide range here, and the solver in this case is doing mostly big bets actually on this flop on Jack 8-5 out of position. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? Is that something we should expect with these out of position lower boards and 3-bet pots? This big bet, what's that about?
Yeah. I think having a big bet makes a lot of sense because you have some very strong hands in your range. Then you have a board, which is pretty dynamical, and because your opponent also have a ton of semi-strong hands, like less nut combos, maybe 5s, 8-8, and sometimes jacks, but that's it. No 2 pairs are included. But a ton of equity the in-position player still has because of all the possible draws.
Right.
So to protecting this equity and having the condition that your hand has also a decent amount of equity leads in my mind that this type of hand class wants to have a big size.
Right. Yeah. And it's very important to say here that, again, there's a big difference between a nut advantage and a range advantage. Like, we are maybe not betting all the time on this flop. We maybe don't have the biggest EV advantage ever, but the EV that we do have is concentrated on these hands that are coolering good hands, right? As you put it, they're like good, they're great, but your opponent has a lot of good. And when that's the case on one of these dynamic flops, the solver's going to bet bigger. Interestingly here, though, Trueteller decides to bet 1/3 pot, which is totally fine with nines. Like, you can do that if it's part of your strategy. But I suspect, again, that the decisions we're seeing a pro like Trueteller make here are more based on, I guess, reads and expected dynamics from the opponent than they are on trying to copy a sim. These guys have studied a lot of sims, but they're not trying to replicate that in this environment where they have, non-professionals against them. So small bet with nines. Any thoughts on why he might prefer to bet smaller here against Paul Foy specifically?
Pretty hard to say. From my perspective would be having it mixed, like check and a small bet, especially with the 9 and heart, and maybe he's doing a small bet to get more information than playing check call.
Interesting.
Could be. So like if he's thinking, okay, he's playing his strong hands also just fast, it will help him a lot by doing a small bet, which you don't figure out by a check.
Yeah.
And if I change the perspective to the possible counter actions of Four, I think having nines and your opponent is folding is fine, calling is pretty fine, and raising is not so great, but at least it's with a 9 in heart, it's okay enough to still defend against the raise.
Yeah. I can see arguments either way here. I think it's one of these spots where if you suspect your opponent's very passive, you don't really want to accept the check call node as the best node for you, because one, you're giving up on protection by checking, so you're letting him realize a lot of equity, and that's okay if you're being compensated on nodes where he's bluffing a lot and you're able to call those bluffs and make money that way. But it's less okay if your opponent's going to be under bluffing and maybe just playing in a straightforward manner, in which case betting small yourself and just thin value betting, protecting, probably has a higher EV, right, than checking and reluctantly calling against a slightly underbluffed range. Even if it's only slightly underbluffed and he's only, he might only be betting, hands that are obvious bluffs and not finding enough of the weirder bluffs, that makes check call worse though, right? It's going to make us more inclined to just bet the underpair here. Small. I like it. I think it could be, I don't really want to check call against this guy. He's not the most aggressive in the world. I'd rather just protect my equity and get value, especially if he's going to turn his hand face up against a small bet more than he should. Yep. So small bet, and with the set here. 24 just calls, which I think is really good. Interestingly, here in my solver, I don't know if your poker scientist agrees, but the hand that's doing the most raising is something like Ace Jack. That's like a value protecting hand that's more vulnerable. Fives is extremely stable here in the sense that the only hands you're going to make your opponent fold by raising with fives are hands that are extremely dead. He's not folding 10-9, he's not folding a flush draw, right? So is there really a reason to raise pocket fives here at this SPR in position, 3-bet pot, where you can get all the money in later as well, and you're unblocking his full betting range, right? You're unblocking that turn barrel. So any thoughts on flop raise versus call here for Foy? Does this sound normal to you, just calling in position?
Yeah, I think it's pretty important to just calling here. The hand has just too much equity. I would want to give him the opportunity to increase it, or at least expecting to increasing it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I like the call. Pretty much, I think it's just a pure call.
Absolutely.
These strong hands.
Yep. Because as the stack to pot ratio gets smaller, we actually focus a bit less on having the nuts for raising and less about having, you're not going from a tiny pot to a big pot here, right? It's not like you're check raising in a single raise pot and then overbetting turn and suddenly bringing all the money into play. For that, you want a very big hand or polarized range or bluff. But for this, the money's already in play, the pot's already pretty huge. So to raise and get it in, you're kind of just having a hand that has enough value, but is also generating lots of useful fold equity, right? And you're not going to get useful fold equity here with fives like you are with ace jack. So that's how I would kind of rationalize that distinction, where ace jack is raising sometimes, but fives is not on jack 8-5. Okay, onto the turn. So this is pretty cool because now on the turn, check by True Teller, which seems good, right? Kind of middle of his range. Sorry, I should say what the turn actually is. Turn is the 3 of clubs. Check by True Teller. He actually has both the 9 of clubs and the 9 of hearts here. So this is a double flush draw board, jack 8-5-3, and clubs and hearts are the flush draws. Having these 9s helps equity, right? Because if Foy bets, we're blocking his outs. A lot of people forget that. They're like, I don't want to block the flush draw. No, you don't want to block the flush draw, but when you block the flush draw, you actually have more equity, right? Because you're holding cards that this guy needs to improve if he's got a flush draw himself. So check by True Teller. Foy bets, and he bets about, I don't know, did you catch the size of that bet there, Sammy?
The pot size was about, the size was about, I think, 40-50%.
Okay. And 9s then already kind of getting closer to indifferent, but maybe not quite indifferent yet. I think we need to think about bluff catchers from the point of view of when are they indifferent, and then we can sort of go from there. But with hearts and clubs, yeah, this is actually a pure call in my software. What does your software think, and what do you think might be going on here with the dynamic and the exploitative elements?
Yeah, also Poker Scientist is just a pure call because he also have all these possible flush draws, straight draws, and even gut shots who's continuing against the check call, because the check call is also giving the imposition player kind of information. Like we have here some check raises with queens, for example, or kings. So this leads to that Paul Four needs a bit less equity to do a second barrel when the range from True Teller is a bit weaker. Now implementing the tendencies, well, it's hard, man. I can feel the pain from True Teller being in this situation. Like, I have such a strong hand. Theoretically, I have to call always, but it's Paul. So, what I should do now, and it's really hard to say. I would be fine with the fold and call. I can respect boss actions totally, because I can't measure how tight Paul really is. I just expect that he's tighter than he should be. So it feels like an unstable state, that when you remove a few bluffs, it is getting a fold, and adding some bluffs, it's very quickly getting a call again.
Yeah.
So it's very hard to say for me here.
I really like the way you put that, like an unstable state. It's like it's balancing on a knife edge, and the slightest change in behaviors is going to swing the EV of the spot very considerably. I think that's a great way to put it. Yeah. What about the argument that if Paul Foy is tight, then he may be bluffing turn and giving up river a bit more often? Like, he's still gonna... We're not saying he's never bluffing turn, right? So we're just saying maybe he triples less, and maybe I don't actually have to call fold as much. And if I don't have to call fold very often, then maybe I'm really happy call folding. And that's actually what True Teller does here. He peels this turn bet, like, okay, let's go. River, I think, bricks off. What was the river? Let's just see. Queen, no, it doesn't brick off, sorry, it's the Queen of Hearts, completing lots of stuff, and then Paul Foy thinks for a bit and jams the river, and True Teller folds. What's your thoughts, and Poker Scientist's thoughts, on this river spot? So just to recap for the audience, Jack 8-5-3, small blind against hijack 3-bet pot, flop goes small c-bet by the 9s in the small blind from True Teller, call by Foy, 3 of clubs on the turn, double flush draw, check by True Teller, 40% pot by Foy, Queen of Hearts, massive earthquake river. What are your and Poker Scientist's thoughts on the player's actions here when it goes check, all in for about 2/3, half pot, I think, about half pot left, and then fold in the end here from True Teller? What are your thoughts?
Well, I think the fold is the right decision, especially on the Queen Hearts. I mean, he's blocking the straight, and probably is not shoving here Queen 10 or Queen 9. But he's also having here some flushes in his range. The SB should also have some flushes, which he's just check calling, like ace 2, ace 3, ace 4, and depending how often he's 3-betting ace X suited in general. And yeah, the queen themselves shouldn't hit SB too much, but the heart is pretty balanced, not a real favorite. I can quickly check it with PS. So PS is saying that the queen, okay, the queen is better than for the in-position player than for the out-of-position player.
Right.
So
right.
Okay. Yeah.
Because so much is check jam on the turn at this stack to pot ratio as well, right? Like check call is a very weird line in this situation. It's not wrong. It just doesn't happen with very many combinations. I think your hand has to be particularly mediocre to call, and the out of position player in Pio here is playing almost always jam or fold to the small turn bet. Even with 9s, it's just jamming for equity denial. It's kind of saying, okay, it won't be very good here in GTO to call turn fold river, therefore call and jam are really similar EV, and again, because the SPR is so small, that protection starts to become more valuable than bluff catching later, right? That's a very common phenomenon in game theory. So yeah, it's weird to get to this river with 9s, and when you do get there, it's actually my solver's mostly just calling on the river, but that assumes that, you know, your opponent's capable of sorry, I'm looking at the wrong node. Ignore everything I just said. I was on the wrong node. Let me just check that on the right node. Check, small bet. Yeah, so interestingly, like, the set on the turn is actually doing some check behind. I don't think that's something that Paul Foy is really going to be doing on the turn. So when he bets... Yeah, 9s is actually the only hand here that's not mixing any shove. 9s to me on my sim is the only hand that's a pure call, and everything better, like, you know, kings, aces, whatever, even 10s is mixing like a bit of raise for me. So it's kind of interesting. It's right in that middle part that's just calling, and then when we get to the river, Queen of Hearts, check. Interestingly, it thinks this is really quite weird. My solver thinks that 5s is mostly a jam, but it's not much EV loss to check. Also, it thinks it's very, very close on this particular card. If 9s is mixing, call and fold with the heart blocker, and folding pure without the heart blocker, if True Teller is folding every combo of 9s here, it could even be possible that Foua's jam is a mistake, just based on the range composition in this spot. Like, that's too thin. That's kind of crazy, but I think that could become the case. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. 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 Having the from a theoretical perspective, like having the 9 hearts is so nice to block the flushes, the straight. But yeah, doing this practice application, I think it's pretty fine to just fold, especially against Paul, who's not checking sometimes the 5s, just
Right.
always jamming, so his value range is getting bigger.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's weird because he has to be bluffing some very strange combos on the river as well. Like, they're very mergy. It's kind of like, well, he doesn't have ace king. He doesn't have a lot of king 10 in this spot. Like, how does he have enough bluffs here unless he's a super solver man like Linus Love? If he's not like solver man, how does he get all of these bluffs into his range here that he needs to have to make us indifferent?
Yeah.
Even when we have the 9 of hearts, I think it's a mandatory fold, and it probably makes the shove with 5s questionable because we are folding a hand that's actually probably one of the best bluff catchers we can have. 9s with the 9 of hearts here is probably a better bluff catcher than, you know, us having ace jack off or something like that with no heart. So it's interesting.
Yeah, if I'm watching here also the bluffing range in Poker Scientist, I see that it's all the bluffing hands on the river and one hand class, or mainly in one hand class, which is turning the very weak showdown hands into a bluff.
Yep.
So all 6x, 7s, 8x, even jack x he wants to shove.
Yep.
So if you exclude all these hands, oh boy.
What is he shoving? What is he bluffing? It just becomes maybe not even an underbluffed spot, but even worse, an unbluffed spot.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so good play by True Teller. So obviously impressed with True Teller's play in both of these hands, like super solid. And you can see just in these hands, by using the training software like Poker Scientist and stuff, you can see where the edge lies, right? You can see how the guys that understand equilibrium use that understanding to make certain tweaks to try and take advantage of the recreational players in a game. And that for me has been the most interesting part of this interview with you. I think it's just like establishing how they're playing really solidly, but they're also leaning towards an exploitative angle as well. Some people think, oh, these guys are just robots, they just play GTO. No, they don't, right? They use that knowledge to become exploitative beasts as well, end bosses.
Yeah.
You know.
Totally. And how flexible they are in their thoughts, like playing against the other guy with the Jack 8 hand very aggressively, and then changing the complete approach and playing then tighter against another player,
Right.
because you're expecting another play style.
Yeah, they don't have a style, they just do whatever's highest EV. And if you have a style, you're putting habits before EV, so it can never be right to have a style. The only style we should have in poker is that which yields the highest EV.
Yeah.
Cool. Oh.
So I expect that he's very extremely solid in GTO, and using this this ability and doing this efficiently exploits against other players.
Totally. Yep.
So pretty impressive.
Yep. Okay, do you want to tell us a little bit more about where people can get set up with Poker Scientist and what it can do for them before we end today's show?
Okay. Yeah, well, we have a website, so poker-scientist.com, and there's some content and some explanation what we are doing. We also have a YouTube channel. Also, it's called Poker Scientist. So it's a mix of content we're doing there from theoretical perspective, but also doing some live sessions, some highlights from my stream. My stream name on Twitch is Samy Baem, so feel free to follow. And yeah, we also have an Instagram account, poker.scientist. So yeah, sometimes we are doing their story where in this story we include a quiz so that we are playing against our bot, and then you can decide what you want to do. And if we have defined what's correct, we are adding an explanation why this specific hand leads into a specific action. So
Nice.
feel free to follow.
Awesome, and we'll check all of that stuff out in the details in the description below. Samy/Chris, it's been a pleasure. I've really enjoyed talking game theory and exploitative poker with you today, and I'll definitely be checking out Poker Scientist. Wish you all the best with the venture, and thanks for coming on the show, man.
Yeah, thanks for the invite. Thanks, man. I appreciate it.
Yep.